All right, we're back today. This is Church History, the second 1,000 years, and we're on lecture number 4. I do want to take a very quick rehearsal or review of what we talked about the last time. What we really did was we got into the beginnings, or part of the major beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. We talked about Wycliffe, his translation of the Bible, English translation of the Bible, John Huss, John Gutenberg, who invented the printing press and printed the first Bible, the Spanish Inquisition, and that is, of course, you remember when the King and the Queen of Spain were given permission by the King, by the Pope, to inquire into the faith of the faithful in Spain, and they kind of carried it to the extreme. They would literally torture people to get them to confess or recant or to so forth, and so that was a big deal in 1478 and around there. Savonarola was executed in 1498. Michelangelo, we talked about him. Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, and that was really a watershed event in Protestant Reformation. Zwingli goes to Switzerland with his Reformation. The Anabaptist movement begins, and then Henry VIII, his Act of Supremacy in 1534, which declared him the head of the Church of England. Now, based on what we talked about the last time, we are continuing that same look at the spread of Protestantism throughout Europe. And I just want to make a few points as we go directly into lecture number 4. In a way, I want to call this the spread, Protestantism spreads throughout Europe and the New World, because in the lessons that we deal with today, that's really what actually happens. Now, let me give you kind of a general overview of where we are up to this point, and I think the first year that we're dealing with today is 1536, but let me kind of give you a little introduction overview of what has happened and what is happening. Gone are the good old days. Right now, in the church in Europe, in the Western world, it is clear that the good old days are gone. Now, what I mean by the good old days is I mean the good old days when there was one church and one pope. Now, you know it took a long time to get to that point, because there was a point at which the church was just a bunch of little Jews running around talking about a man named Jesus. But it evolved to the point where it was one church across the entire Roman Empire, and it was headed by one head who was the Pope. Well, what you see happening now is you see the breakup of that. There's no longer just one church. There are several churches. And because of that, all of this unrest and discontent that you see exists because back in the day, there was only one church and one pope. But now, throughout the course of times, this one church has been divided because of political reasons, theological reasons, personal reasons, and it's no longer one monolithic kind of organization. Then secondly, in the good old days, it was one empire and one emperor. Not only was it one church, you know, the Roman Catholic Church with the Pope as its head, it was also the Roman Empire with the Roman Emperor at the head of the Roman Empire. So that you had a convergence, you had a similarity, a likeness, a superimposition, if you will, that just as there was one church, there was one empire, so that they went together. It wasn't like you had a bunch of little kingdoms running around and a bunch of little churches, but that's what's beginning to happen right now. So this unity that used to take place in former days is now being broken up. Now, of course, I do have to say, when I say unity, that I don't mean that everybody in the Catholic Church, when it was one, was in agreement with everything that happened, but at least there was one structure, and everybody dealt with that one structure. So now, there's no longer one church and one pope. There's no longer one empire and one emperor. And then the opposition which the Catholic Church receives used to be primarily within the church. So if there were people who dissented with Catholicism, like Benedict, who went out and started the Benedictine order of monks, they did it with an eye toward remaining inside the Catholic Church. Their goal was to either reform the church or to speak against the church to the degree that the church would be corrected, not that they would leave the church. And of course they couldn't leave the church because there was nowhere to go. If there was only one church and one pope and one empire and one emperor, where were they going to go outside of the reign and the rule of the church? That was the good old days. But the good old days are gone. By the time we get to this 16th century, actually they start to dissipate during the 15th century, but by the time we get to where we are, to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, there is the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and because of Henry VIII's declaration that he was the head of the Church of England, now it's the English Church. And so instead of one church, you have many churches. Then the opposition to the Catholic Church is both within and without. You have people within the Catholic Church who are critical of the way it functions, but do not leave the church. And then you have people in the church, or Christians, who are critical of the way the Catholic Church functions, and they disassociate themselves and separate themselves from the church. So now what is beginning to happen is criticism of the Catholic Church is not new. What is new is that the critics are not only inside the church, but they're moving away from the church, outside of the church, and starting their own brands of Christianity. They're not just leaving the church and becoming atheists. They're leaving the church and starting their own understandings of what the church ought to be. Now, you remember some of the roots of this are the creation of the universities of Paris and Oxford and Cambridge and all of those, and the secularization process that began to take place. And all of this is possible because there are now people outside of the church who study outside of the church, who are educated outside of the church, who live their lives literally outside of the church, who can now take a different perspective on the church's theology. So that's what's happening now during the 16th century at the time of the Protestant Reformation. And then thirdly, during these days that we're talking about, there's division among the Protestants. Now that's funny. It's not funny, but it's funny. It's completely predictable because whereas there was one church and all of the dissent was inside the church, now you've got many churches, and you have many people criticizing the churches, and then they criticize each other. So you have people who are Protestant, they gather together and they're unified in that they all are against the Catholic Church. But then they're against each other on various theological issues. So that's what I hope you can see happening through this Protestant Reformation. You have the church, the Catholic Church, fighting off these groups of people who don't agree with its theology and its practices. But then as these different groups face the Catholic Church and then turn around and face each other, they discover that they disagree with each other. So now you have this explosion, if you will, during the Protestant Reformation of people who take a piece of their problem with the Catholic Church and make a whole denomination out of that. Do you hear what I'm saying? Instead of saying all of us, let's get together with all of the things that we disagree with and create a church, it's like, no, I don't like this about the church, and so I run with this. Or I don't like this about the church, and I run with this. And they are what I call denominational distinctives. It's not a phrase that you might find in a book. It's just a phrase I made up. But I call them denominational distinctives because they are the key and core theological values or statements that distinguish one denomination from another. So why do we have, for example, Presbyterians and Lutherans and Baptists and Mennonites and Puritans? It's because as you look at the way that they protested against the Catholic Church, there was a piece that each one of those groups thought was extremely prominent, and they played that piece to the hilt. And they played that so much to the hilt that there were other Protestants who said, well, no, that ain't that important. but this is the most important thing. And so then they began to build their whole denomination around that. And as we go through these lessons that we have for this week, we will see that actually happening. I just wanted to give you kind of a big picture of what's going on, and that is what's going on. The church is wrestling with how to deal with the criticisms within it, how to deal with the criticisms without it, and then the people who are criticizing the church on the outside are finding themselves being criticized by other Protestants who say, no, that's not the real issue. So, having said all of that, let's go directly to our first person that we have here in our text for this week, and that would be John Calvin. Now, John Calvin is, needless to say, a critical and important personality in the history of Christianity. He was a person who was familiar with Luther. He was conversant, obviously, with the writings of Luther, and he broke from the Catholic Church, left his homeland of France, and was in exile in Switzerland. So Switzerland was his base of operation, particularly in the city of Geneva. And at the age of 27, he wrote, or at least wrote the first, began writing what has come to be called the Institutes of the Christian Religion. And this book, or this work of theology, is what's called systematic theology. I happen to have a copy for your consideration. This is one of the copies that I used when I was in seminary. This is volume 1, and this is volume 2 of the Institutes of Christian Religion. And in it is what you call systematic theology, and systematic theology is an attempt to get all of the themes, the doctrines, the ideas of the faith together in a system. In other words, instead of just saying, I believe in baptism, it takes baptism and ties that to Christology, and ties that to theology, and ties that to ecclesiology, which is the study of the church. And so this idea of a systematic theology is not just saying, I believe in God. It's a way of creating a whole substructure, if you will, or foundation for the faith that we have. And he is not the first one to do it, but he is one who has done it across the ages and done it well. For example, chapter 1 is what it is to know God, and he talks about the tendency of this knowledge. And this all has to do with, theological statements and doctrines in the Bible. The first one is the first book is of the knowledge of God the Creator. So he goes on and on and on and on and on about that. So I'll just pass this around so that you can look at John Calvin's Institutes and see that it was a pretty substantial book. Calvin's claim to fame is predestination. Predestination. Whenever you say John Calvin, the first thing that comes to most people's minds is predestination. He is not the first one to talk about predestination, but he is most closely associated with it because of how clearly he articulated it and how well he ran with it. Basically, what predestination says is that you really don't have any choice in whether or not you are saved. Those who are saved were predestined by God to be saved. They are the elect. And, at the beginning of history, God said, you, and you. And there's nothing you, and you can do about it because your salvation has been predetermined and predestined by God. Now, when I have here that he's high on the sovereignty of God, what it suggests is that there are two poles in your thinking of theology. One is God's sovereignty, and the other is human freedom or human choice. The higher you are on the sovereignty and the power of God, the lower you become on human choice. Because you say, if God is that powerful, then he makes all the decisions and you don't really have a choice. Now, the higher you become on human choice, the lower you become on the sovereignty of God. And so John Calvin's decision was, because he believed so much that God was sovereign, that God was, quote unquote, in complete control of everything, that also extended to our salvation, to the degree that you could not choose to be saved. God did that for you. So now the question is, if we have been predestined to be saved and we cannot choose to be saved, number one, how does a person get saved? Well, they get saved because God chose them. Number two, how do you know you're saved? You only know you're saved by living a moral life to show your salvation, not to gain your salvation. So I know that another person is saved not because I heard them give some confession of faith, because the confession of faith doesn't save them. What saves them is God elected them. But I know they're saved because of the life that they live. So what John Calvin, with his predestination doctrine, began to teach and preach is that people should show their salvation by the life that they live, not get their salvation by coming to Christ voluntarily. Okay? So this is a very, very, very powerful doctrine, because once you begin to do this, you can take this same doctrine and extend it not just to salvation, but extend it to everything else. The reason you are poor is because God predetermined it. The reason you are rich is because God predetermined it. The reason you are anything is because God predetermined it. And so the question is, what choice do I have? What degree do I participate in the things that go on in my life? And this doctrine has been used to justify hundreds of abuses, including slavery and the like, because the reason you are a slave is because God predetermined it. No sense in trying to be free, no sense in trying to be liberated, no sense in trying to be anything but what you are, because the only reason that you're a slave is because God predetermined it. And this sense of predestination also inclines people not to change the order of things, because the way things are were predetermined by God. Why are you, if you're a slave, why are you going to buck slavery? Because God determined that you should be a slave. You know, he predetermined that you should be a slave. Just try to do the best you can as a slave. So what I'm saying is Calvin did not go as far as his followers took it. But the premise is that everything is predetermined, predestined by God. And once that happens, then you can take that concept and spread it over the economy, spread it over relationships, spread it over anything you want to. And John Calvin is the one that we have to thank or spank for this particular concept of predestination. All right, so his Institutes of the Christian Religion are something that I shared with you, and that's one of his major works. I also have with me, and these books come from my my personal library. This is one of his commentaries. This is a commentary on the epistles of Paul to the Romans and Thessalonians. So this is one book. See how thick it is? It's just one book that he wrote as a commentary on two books of Scripture. He has commentaries on, the whole Bible. And so this is number 8. So God only knows how many there are. We know there are more than 8, but this is just one of them. I'm just trying to give you a sense of the magnitude of these people's writings. When you see in this little thing, which is only 3 pages, that he wrote the Institutes of the religion, of the Christian religion, on religion. So okay, so you see he wrote that, but then you see those 2 fat volumes. It's like, wow. And then you say it says there, well, he wrote some commentaries on the Bible. This is one of them. So these people were not just laying around looking out the window. They were working and they were writing. And whatever you say about what they came up with, they were very, very prolific in what they did. Okay, so that's John Calvin. And one thing I want you to associate with John Calvin, the primary thing, is this predestination. And as he used predestination to create the foundation of this notion that people who are saved are only saved because God chose it and not because they chose it. Now, again, you need to see this in the context of the Catholic Church, who says that salvation comes through them. So what he's really saying is that the church doesn't save you, God saves you. That's how you need to see that contrast, because up to this point, what's being preached is if you want to be saved, you got to come through the church. Calvin says, no, if you want to be saved, you got to come through God, but you don't really come through God. God already did it, so the Catholic Church doesn't do anything for you. All right? Now, Pope approves of the Jesuits. Now, the Jesuit movement is what is called the Counter-Reformation, or part of the Counter-Reformation. And the Counter-Reformation is what is going on inside of the Catholic Church to counteract these people who are protesting the church. So the church is kind of moving on this protest in two different fronts. The first front is to excommunicate and squash and burn the Protestants. The other front is to kind of regroup and say, okay, well, based on what these people are saying, well, maybe we need to think this through again. And so what the Jesuits did under a fellow by the name of Ignatius Loyola, what he did was he was in the vein or in the same tradition of many of the monks that had lived before, and he began to call the church back to a closer sense of devotion and a closer sense of faith and so forth, and obedience to the church. So it's almost like circling the wagons. It's like, okay, all of these guys, these people are running around here, Luther and Calvin are saying the church is not teaching this properly, the church is not. So what Loyola ended up doing is promoting obedience to the Pope, promoting obedience to the church, and reaffirming the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience in his monastic order, and doing it in the sense of, like, instead of changing, we're just going to get together and speak a little louder that we're right. You know how that is. That's one response to protest. Instead of dealing with the protest, what you really do is you just get together and say, we're right, aren't we? Yeah, we're right. And so he was not a person who wanted to leave the Catholic Church. He did want to call the church back to its original mission, if you will, of purity and faith and so forth, but he did so within the Catholic Church and not outside the Catholic Church, as Luther and Calvin and others had done. One little side note is that he is famous for writing this book called Spiritual Exercises. It's a devotional manual that he put together, things that people can and should meditate on. I have a copy of this book here. This book I bought and read about 1,000 years ago. When I was a student. I'll pass that around too. That's the Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola. I also throw a little personal note here. The high school that I went to was called Loyola High School because it was a Jesuit high school in Towson, Maryland. And so I am to that extent indebted to this man because I went to a school which was in the line of his thinking and of his order of priests. An interesting claim to fame about Loyola is that he began to spread his Jesuit movement not only throughout Europe but all around the world. And we have here in this text, it says ultimately he took it to Japan, Brazil, Ethiopia, and Central Africa. And so we have these Jesuits all over the world now, and this is because of the faith and the movement of this one man. When I think of Jesuits personally, as a result of having gone to a Jesuit high school, the first thing that comes to my mind is education. They are well-educated people, and they promote education extremely, extremely hard. And so Loyola, Ignatius Loyola, is a person that should be listed among the 100 most important events or people because of his impact and his attempt to try to get the church right within as opposed to leaving the church. Okay? The Council of Trent. Now, we're still talking about counter-Reformation activities. What the Catholic Church is attempting to do in the face of the criticism of these Protestants that they are raising. And in the Council of Trent in 1545, we see the Pope calling people together, calling a council together, so that they can deal with some of these issues and make some recommendations to him and to the church in general as to what they can do or ought to do to counteract this criticism that's being raised and leveled against them by Protestants. And what they end up doing is, number one, they admit that there are and have been abuses in the monasteries, abuses in the priesthood, abuses in the clergy. So they admit that there have been abuses. And they also, during the Council of Trent in 1545, abolish indulgences. You remember the indulgences were created to help people buy their way out of purgatory. And so you could pay for your sins, and you could pay for the sins of people who were dead. And it really became somewhat of a sin racket, if you will. But in any way, this was abolished. This was one of the complaints that the Protestants had against the church. But even though it abolished abolished the indulgences and admitted abuses, what the Council of Trent basically did was reaffirmed what the church believed in terms of the sacraments of the church, 7 sacraments versus the 2 of the Protestants. Protestants only believed in 2, which was baptism and communion. It did not accept that people could know that they were justified, and it continued to maintain transubstantiation. That's in the communion, where the wine and the bread become the body of Christ, and it continued the practice of Mass held in Latin. So the Council of Trent went a little ways to acknowledge that the church had made some errors in terms of its directions and practices, but basically what it did is it simply reaffirmed what they had been doing, and instead of creating a bridge between the Catholics and the Protestants, it continued to divide them even more. 1549, we have a fellow by the name of Thomas Cranmer. And he is the Archbishop of Canterbury. Remember Anselm, who was the Bishop of Canterbury years ago, 500 years ago, 400 or 500 years earlier. I'm trying to tell you how old these churches are. And so it's a continuous a continuous church, if you will. And so as the Archbishop of Canterbury, this Cranmer fella, he begins a reform movement in England. And during that, they remove images from the churches. Private confession is discontinued. Clergy are allowed to marry, which is a new thing. And Calvinist scholars like Martin Bucer, Peter Martyr come to teach in England at Oxford and Cambridge. And so England becomes a place where people come because the climate is there, kind of anti-Catholic climate and a pro-secularism climate. And they come there so that they can kind of freely pursue their religious faith. Now, he is also credited with writing, or helping to write, the Book of Common Prayer, which was a book of liturgy aimed at replacing the Catholic Mass, and its goal was to be acceptable to both Catholics and Protestants. Now, you remember in England, King Henry VIII declared himself the head of the church, and that was the Anglican or English church. Well, since he's the head of the church in England, he wants to distance himself from the church in Rome. And one way to do that is to take the language of the worship from Latin, which was a Latin Mass, into English, which is something he wanted to do. And what this Book of Common Prayer does is it gives worship and liturgical resources for English churches. And this was 1549, and this Book of Common Prayer is used to this day in Anglican churches. as a basis for their worship. Okay? Then in 1549, the Act of Uniformity required churches to use the Book of Common Prayer. The book was written, when was it written? The Book of Common Prayer? Well, we know, okay, it was written in 1549. And during that same year, it was required by the king for all churches to use it. So now the Pope says all churches should use the Latin Mass. King Henry VIII says we're not with the Romans anymore, not the Roman Catholic Church. We got our own church, and we want our church people to use the Book of Common Prayer. So that creates, as this act suggests, uniformity within English churches throughout the land. Okay, he was forced, this is John Cranmer, was forced to denounce his Protestant views under Queen Mary, but later publicly affirmed them, for which he was burned. This whole idea of recanting, this idea of taking back your criticisms of the church is something which we have seen played itself out over and over again throughout the course of the history of the church. But ultimately, he refused to denounce his faith, and as a result of that, he was burned. Now, I hope you see and will see that over and over again, the conflict between the king, the queen, and the religious leaders rises and falls upon where they happen to be in their faith. Because you will have, for example, one king that will rise, and he may be pro-Catholic, and when he's pro-Catholic, then he gets rid of all the Protestants, and then he may die, and his child comes to the throne, and his child is pro-Protestant, then they get rid of all the Catholics. And so it's really the whole life of the Protestants is trying to find a space, a climate, where their faith can be allowed to grow without them being persecuted. But that changes so much because as the leaders change at the head of the countries, so does the climate for their particular faith. All right, let's go to John Knox. John Knox in 1559, he was a disciple of Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland. And in 1559, he leads the Reformation in Scotland. Now, in 1560, the Parliament of Scotland states that the Pope has no authority in Scotland and forbade the Mass. Now, remember that Henry VIII said that the Pope has no authority in England. Now, in Scotland, they're saying that the Pope has no authority in Scotland, and they're basically becoming their own independent church. Now, John Knox wrote the Book of Discipline to replace the Catholic order, which became the basis of government for the Presbyterian Church, and he wrote the Book of Common Order to guide worship. So just as Cranmer wrote the Book of Common Prayer to be a worship guide for the English, Knox wrote the Book of Common Order to be a worship guide for the Scottish. And the Book of Discipline is a government guide for the church, the Presbyterian Church that had its beginning with John Knox. Presbyterian is a church run by elders. That whole term presbytery is in the Bible, and it's translated as elders. And that is the form of government that John Knox put together, a church run by elders, and that is the beginning of the Presbyterian Church. Okay? St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572. In this time, Calvinism and Protestantism comes to France, and the French Protestants are called the Huguenots. The French Protestants are called the Huguenots. Now, Queen Catherine, who is not too keen on the Protestants, she is more pro-Catholic than Protestants, she decides that she is going to get rid of all of the French leaders of the Protestant movement. And by doing that, she orders the killing of the leaders of the French Protestant movement, which are called the Huguenots. And before it was all over, as many as 40,000 people were killed, including babies. it's pretty scary to think that people have this kind of hatred and this kind of disgust or disdain for people who believe other than them. But as you can see, this is really what happened, and it happened to the degree that 40,000 people are dead. All right. So now this is the St. Bartholomew's Day's massacre, and that's basically all that I want to say about that. I do want you to see, though, that what we're doing is we are going kind of country by country, as well as political movement, as well as Reformation movement by movement, and we kind of see who's doing what where. Remember how we said that Patrick brought the gospel to Ireland and so forth? Well, what we're doing now is we're showing people who were instrumental in not only starting Reformation groups, but where those groups were actually started. John Smith. John Smith was a part of this Protestant Reformation because there were two groups of people who responded to the Anglican Church in England. One group said, we still want to be Anglican, but we want to purify the Anglican Church. The other group, they were called Puritans, or Puritans, and the other group were people who said we want to be separated from the Church of England completely, and they were called separatists. So remember, we started off with people separating from the Catholic Church, and the king started his own church. Well, now you got people who want to separate from the King's Church and start their own church, and they become the Puritans and the Baptists. Now, these Puritans and the Baptists, they start this separate church or separatist church in 1606, and their claim to fame is, like the Anabaptists, they don't believe that the church should have, that the state should run the church, or that the church should be run by the state, to put it another way. And so they want to separate out from underneath the Anglican Church, because the king is the head of the Anglican Church. All right. They leave because of persecution. Obviously, when they start talking about separating from the King's Church, they got to get out of town, which is what they do. And they go to Amsterdam. And after being in Amsterdam for a while, they begin to get associated with the Mennonites, one of the Anabaptist people that we talked about the last time, and emphasize more and more state separation of church and state, and the fact that they were against infant baptism. And this fellow, John Smythe, baptizes about 40 people, and according to our text, this is the beginning of the Baptist church. In this church, in the Baptist church, they had particularly two types of Baptists, or they had them at that time. They were General Baptists and Particular Baptists. The difference between the General Baptists and the Particular Baptists is General Baptists believe that Christ died for all of humanity and not just for the elect. And Particular Baptists are people who believe that Christ died just for the elect. Now let's go back to Calvin and remember, so we've got people who are now Baptists in the structure and their emphasis on adult baptism and separation of church and state, but they're picking up a little bit of Calvin in saying that Christ died, yeah, but he only died for the people that were already elected, not for everybody. And that distinguishes some Baptists from other Baptists, okay? And so even among, as I said, the Protestants, they are making distinctions between themselves and therefore creating other denominations. The Particular Baptists and ultimately the General Baptists began practicing baptism by immersion. The Anabaptists, when they first started their adult baptism, they baptized people through sprinkling. The Baptists, under John Smythe and his crowd, were among the first to do it as immersion and make immersion one of their denominational distinctions. Okay? 1611, we have the publication of the King James Bible. The King of England, by the name of James, I think James the First, he called together 54 scholars to translate the Bible into English. And they used original texts and other translations such as the Geneva Bible, the Wycliffe Bible, the Tyndale Bible, and so forth. It took 4 years for them to translate from 1607 to 1611. And That's basically the story on the King James Version. It is very interesting that it was commissioned by somebody other than the Pope or the church. But remember, in England, the king was the head of the church. And what he was trying to do is he was trying to do two things. Number one, get a Bible that was translated by people who were not Calvinists. And number two, create an up-to-date English Bible so that it would be available more so for people who spoke English. The more he could push English, the less reliant he would be on the Roman Catholic Church, who had Latin. And so this is just as much a political thing as it is a spiritual thing. It's probably more of a political movement on his part than a spiritual movement. But this King James Version, which we have now, which is almost 500 years old, according to some people, if it's not the King James, it ain't the Bible. But you do need to understand that the King James Version is itself a translation. It is not the original Bible, although it's the only Bible that many people know. 1620, the Pilgrims signed the Mayflower Compact. And these pilgrims, they call themselves pilgrims because a pilgrim, as you know, is a person who is traveling through a land, doesn't have really a homeland. And even when they were at home in Holland, they didn't feel like they had a home, so they considered themselves just passing through or traveling. They left England to escape the influence of the Anglican Church and the king because of their protest against the Church of England. And they go to America to set up a pure society. That's why they're called the Puritans. So the New World was not just a place for people to come to start a new nation as a political entity. For the most part, these people like the Pilgrims, came here to find a place free of persecution where they would be away from the thumb of the King of England and away from the persecution not only of other Anglicans but of Catholics as well. And they came to America thinking that by coming here they could create a society which was more like the kingdom of God. They started off, set sail from Europe, and they were headed for Virginia, but they ran into a little storm, and it blew them off course, way off course, and they landed in Massachusetts. And when they got to Massachusetts, they developed this Mayflower Compact. And the Mayflower Compact was basically the document which laid out the form of government that they would have in the New World, which they hoped would approximate the kingdom of God. So the Mayflower was the name of the boat. The Mayflower Covenant was the name of the document or the agreement that the people on the Mayflower, these pilgrims on the Mayflowers, agreed upon to be the guidelines, the rules, the charter, the Constitution, if you will, of the group that they decided to have once they finally landed ashore. Okay, and then lastly for this week, Comenius is driven from his homeland. This is the Protestant movement in Poland, also Bohemia, and he is famous for writing an allegorical book called The Labyrinth of the World. He emphasizes education for young children. He wrote the first illustrated textbook for children and is considered the father of modern education. Now, we've said a lot and we've watched the Protestant Reformation move around a lot. I want you to look at this thing I have here on the last page under summary, and this is basically what I want you to remember about all that I have said. I want you to remember that Calvin was primarily responsible for giving us the emphasis on predestination, and his base was Switzerland. The Jesuits were a part of the Counter-Reformation. They were trying to reform the church, the Catholic Church, from the inside by calling it back to devotion and faith and, not being outlandish in its abuses. And in so doing, they spread their doctrine and their monks and their priests all over the world. Cranmer did his thing in England. He helped to bring the Book of Common Prayer to England. Actually, he wrote that. and in so doing, he gave the English an alternative to the Latin Mass. And so now they could worship God in a English style and not be dependent upon the Catholics, the Roman Catholics. John Knox was a Protestant who primarily functioned in Scotland, and he is the father and founder of the Presbyterian movement. And the Presbyterian movements, their claim to fame is that structure of government being led by elders in the church. The Huguenots are the French Protestants who endured much persecution in France, including the slaughter of thousands of them. John Smythe led and started the Baptist Church in Amsterdam. The Pilgrims left Europe and they came to America. They left England primarily, came to America looking to create or recreate a society, a kingdom of God there in America without having to deal with the king or the pope. And then Comenius is a person whose Protestant Reformation was taken to Poland. Now, one last thing and then we'll be done. I did provide for you a map which may help you at least get an idea of where all of this stuff is going on. This is a map of Europe in the year 1500. And one of the things I want you to see, first of all, the map is in color so you can see each country, the various countries. But I want you to see how many times you see on this map kingdom. Kingdom of Scotland, Kingdom of England, Kingdom of France, Kingdom of Portugal, Kingdom of Denmark. And that just pushes the point that I've been trying to make, that all of these countries are under one king, and yet Catholicism is trying to cross over kingdoms. So it's not like you have one church in one nation. You have one church trying to span several nations. But when they cross that political border into another nation, they had to deal with whoever the king is over there. And if that king is pro-Catholic, then they have a certain environment. If that king is pro-Protestant, then they have another environment, and it just changes over and over again. So it's no more that you could just color this whole map, even though they were different nations, they were all under the Roman Empire. It's not like that anymore. And so this makes it possible for division that we are seeing. We also see that there are certain countries, not only that are more inclined toward Catholicism or Protestantism, but within these countries, people can move around from one to the other. So if they get kicked out of France, they go to Switzerland. Kicked out of Switzerland, they go to Holland, and so on and so forth. I just wanted to give you a picture of this so you can see all of this movement taking place is actually taking place in different lands, in different countries, under different conditions. Okay, that's enough for now. We've gotten